Munich, Germany, September 5th, 1972, 4:30 in the morning. 8 men in tracksuits scale a fence at the Olympic Village. They carry duffel bags filled with AK-47 assault rifles, grenades, and enough ammunition to start a small war. Within 20 hours, 11 Israeli athletes will be dead. And within 48 hours, a woman named Golda Meir will authorize the most extensive assassination campaign in modern intelligence history. An operation so vast it would span 3 continents, last 2 decades, and claim lives in Rome, Paris, Beirut, Cyprus, and quiet European streets where bullets found their targets in broad daylight. This is Operation Wrath of God, the story of how a nation transformed grief into vengeance, how bureaucracy became the architecture of death, and how a grandmother's signature launched a shadow war that would redefine state-sponsored assassination forever. The Olympic Village was supposed to be a sanctuary. After the horrors of World War II, Germany had designed the 1972 Munich Games as a celebration of peace, openness, and international brotherhood. Security was deliberately minimal. Fences were low. Guards were unarmed. The message was clear. This was a new Germany, one that trusted the world. That trust would prove fatal. The 8 men who climbed the fence at 31 Connollystrasse were members of Black September, a Palestinian militant organization named after the bloody month in 1970 when Jordan expelled the PLO. Their leader, Lutif Afif, codenamed Issa, had spent months planning this operation. He knew the Israeli team's location. He knew their schedules. He knew exactly when the athletes would be sleeping and when they would be most vulnerable. At 4:31 a.m., wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg heard scratching at the door of apartment 1. He opened it to find masked men with assault rifles. Weinberg, a massive man who had survived wars, immediately understood what was happening. He threw his body against the door, shouting warnings to his teammates. The gunmen fired through the wood. Weinberg staggered back, bleeding from his cheek, but continued fighting. He attacked one terrorist with his bare hands, allowing weightlifter Yosef Romano to escape briefly before being recaptured. For his resistance, Weinberg was shot dead. Romano, who tried to overpower a guard despite a torn knee ligament, was executed next. His body was left on the floor where the remaining hostages could see it, a message about what happened to those who resisted. But here's the detail that would haunt Israeli intelligence for years. The terrorists didn't just want hostages, they wanted an audience. They dragged their captives to the balcony, let cameras capture masked faces and bound athletes, and issued demands that the whole world would hear. They wanted 234 Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails, plus Andreas Bader and Ulrike Meinhof from German custody. They set a deadline. And then they waited, knowing that every hour of live television coverage was a victory for their cause. The negotiations that followed were a masterpiece of failure. German authorities had no counterterrorism unit trained for hostage rescue. They offered unlimited money. The terrorists refused. They offered to substitute German officials as hostages. The terrorists laughed. They offered safe passage to any Arab country. The terrorists demanded a plane. What happened next would become a case study in how not to conduct rescue operations. At 10:10 p.m., German police positioned snipers at Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, where a Boeing 727 waited to fly the terrorists and hostages to Cairo. The plan was simple: kill the terrorists as they crossed the tarmac before they could reach the aircraft. But German commanders had catastrophically underestimated the enemy. They believed there were only 4 or 5 terrorists. There were 8. They positioned only 5 snipers. None had telescopic sights. None had radio communication. None had trained together for this scenario. When the 2 terrorist leaders walked toward the plane to inspect it, the snipers opened fire. They missed. Both terrorists ran back to the helicopters where the hostages waited, bound and helpless. What followed was a 90-minute firefight in which German police proved incapable of hitting targets or coordinating movement. At 12:04 a.m., one terrorist threw a grenade into a helicopter. Another turned his AK-47 on the bound athletes. Within seconds, 9 Israeli Olympians were dead. They had been murdered on German soil, on live television, while the world watched and the authorities failed. The first phone call reached Golda Meir's office at 3 a.m. Israel time. The Prime Minister, a 74-year-old grandmother who had survived pogroms in Ukraine and built a nation from nothing, listened in silence as her aide described the massacre. When he finished, she asked a single question: "Are there survivors?" There were none. What happened in the following 72 hours would remain classified for decades. Meir convened an emergency meeting of the Israeli cabinet, the Knesset, and the heads of intelligence services. The mood was not grief. It was cold, calculated fury. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan argued for immediate military strikes against Palestinian camps in Lebanon and Syria. Air Force commanders presented bombing targets. But Meir wanted something different. She wanted names. She wanted faces. She wanted the men who planned Munich to understand that there was no place on earth where they could hide. "Send forth the boys," she reportedly said, using a phrase from the Book of Samuel. The boys she referred to were Mossad's most elite operatives, and the mission she authorized would become known as Operation Wrath of God. The operational architecture was unlike anything Mossad had attempted before. Previous targeted killings had been opportunistic, eliminating Nazi war criminals discovered by chance or scientists whose deaths could disrupt enemy weapons programs. Wrath of God was systematic. It required building a target list, locating each individual, maintaining surveillance across multiple countries, and executing assassinations without leaving traces that could embarrass Israel diplomatically. It required patience measured in years and budgets measured in millions. General Aharon Yariv, the Prime Minister's counterterrorism advisor, was tasked with coordinating intelligence. He worked with Mossad director Zvi Zamir to identify everyone connected to Munich, not just the 8 men who crossed that fence, but the planners, the financiers, the logistics coordinators, and the ideological leaders who made Black September possible. The list eventually grew to include over 30 names, each one marked with a red page, an open authorization for elimination that would remain active until the target was dead or the operation was officially terminated. The killing teams were called Kaidan, Hebrew for bayonet. They operated in cells of 5 to 12 operatives, each with specialized roles. A Katsa, or case officer, coordinated overall mission planning. Surveillance teams tracked targets for weeks before any action. Logistics specialists arranged safe houses, vehicles, weapons, and escape routes. And the executioners themselves, often military veterans with combat experience, carried out the final act. No single operative knew the full picture. Compartmentalization ensured that if one was captured, they could reveal only fragments. But here's what made Wrath of God different from standard intelligence operations. The killings were designed to send messages. Quick, quiet eliminations in private would accomplish the strategic objective of removing threats. But they wouldn't create fear. They wouldn't demonstrate that Israeli reach extended everywhere. So Mossad chose methods that were deliberately dramatic. Bombs in telephones, gunshots in busy streets, explosions in apartment buildings. Each death was a headline. Each headline was a warning. The first target was Wael Zwider, a Palestinian poet and translator living in Rome. Intelligence files described him as a PLO representative who had helped coordinate the Munich attack, though this claim would later be disputed. On October 16, 1972, just 6 weeks after Munich, 2 Mossad operatives waited in the lobby of Zwider's apartment building on Piazza Annibaliano. When he returned home at 10:30 p.m., they approached from behind. One operative shot him 12 times with a Beretta .22 caliber pistol, the same number of Israelis killed at Munich. Zwider collapsed in the doorway, still clutching a copy of 1001 Nights that he had been translating into Italian. The next target fell 2 months later. Mahmoud Hamshari was Black September's representative in France, a man intelligence files described as deeply involved in Munich planning. On December 8, 1972, a Mossad team entered his Paris apartment while he was away and replaced the base of his telephone with an identical unit containing plastic explosive. They also planted a listening device in the room. The next morning, an operative called Hamshari's number. When he answered and confirmed his identity, "Is this Dr. Hamshari?" The operative transmitted a signal that detonated the bomb. The explosion destroyed the lower half of Hamshari's body. He died in a hospital 1 month later, never revealing what he knew about Israeli intelligence operations. But the third killing revealed something about wrath of God that official histories rarely acknowledge. Not every target was clearly guilty. Hussein Abu al-Khair was a Palestinian academic working at the PLO office in Cyprus. Mossad files claimed he was connected to Black September operations, but the evidence was thin. On January 24, 1973, operatives attached a bomb to his hotel bed in Nicosia. When he lay down that evening, the pressure trigger activated. The explosion killed him instantly. Cypriot authorities investigated for months but identified no suspects. Years later, some Israeli intelligence officers would privately question whether al-Khair was truly connected to Munich or whether he had been targeted based on association rather than evidence. The operation accelerated through 1973, claiming lives across Europe with methodical precision. Basil al-Kubaisi, an Iraqi law professor believed to be a PFLP weapons procurement specialist, was shot dead on a Paris street in April. Mohamed Boudia, an Algerian theatrical director who managed Black September's European logistics network, died when a bomb hidden beneath his car seat exploded in June. Boudia's death was particularly significant because he had been responsible for recruiting Carlos the Jackal, who would later become the world's most wanted terrorist. By eliminating Boudia, Mossad had disrupted a network whose full scope they were only beginning to understand. But it was the Beirut operation that demonstrated wrath of God's true ambition. In the early hours of April 10, 1973, Israeli commandos landed on a Lebanese beach south of Beirut. The team, led by future Prime Minister Ehud Barak, disguised as a woman, moved inland in rental cars. Their targets were 3 senior PLO leaders living in upscale apartment buildings: Kamal Adwan, who directed commando operations; Mohammed Youssef Najjar, the PLO's senior intelligence officer; and the poet Kamal Nasser, who handled media and propaganda. What followed was not a quiet assassination, but a military assault. Israeli soldiers stormed the apartment buildings, killed bodyguards in firefights, and executed the 3 leaders in front of their families. Adwan's wife watched as commandos shot her husband more than a dozen times. Najjar was killed alongside his wife, who threw herself across him in a futile attempt to shield his body. The operation killed over 30 people, including Lebanese civilians and security guards. Israeli forces then withdrew to the beach and departed by sea, leaving behind a nation in shock and a clear message: PLO leadership was not safe even in their own capital. The Beirut raid transformed wrath of God from a covert assassination program into something approaching open warfare. Arab governments denounced Israeli aggression. European nations questioned whether they were hosting murderers with diplomatic immunity. And within Mossad itself, some officers began questioning the strategic logic. Each killing generated international condemnation, complicated relationships with allied intelligence services, and provided propaganda victories to Palestinian causes. Were they actually degrading terrorist capabilities or simply feeding a cycle of violence that could never end? Those doubts crystallized into disaster in Lillehammer, Norway. Ahmed Bouchiki was a Moroccan waiter working at a swimming pool in the quiet Norwegian town. He had no connection to terrorism, no involvement with Palestinian politics, and no idea that Israeli intelligence had confused him with Ali Salame, the operations chief of Black September and Mossad's highest priority target. On July 21, 1973, a Kidon team tracked Bouchiki as he left a movie theater with his pregnant wife. 2 operatives approached on a quiet residential street. They fired 14 bullets into him at close range. Bouchiki collapsed and died on the sidewalk while his wife screamed for help. The killing of an innocent man was catastrophic enough. What followed was worse. Norwegian police moved with unprecedented speed, arresting 6 Mossad operatives within hours. The agents' tradecraft had been sloppy. They had used rental cars that could be traced, safe houses with thin covers, and communication methods that left evidence. Under interrogation, several operatives broke, providing information about Mossad's structure, methods, and the existence of wrath of God itself. Israel was humiliated. The program was exposed, and the families of the truly guilty received the gift of temporary safety. 5 operatives were convicted in Norwegian courts and sentenced to prison terms of up to 5.5 years. Israel was forced to pay substantial reparations to Bouchiki's family. The intelligence establishment that had prided itself on professionalism was revealed as capable of catastrophic error. Prime Minister Meir suspended Wrath of God operations, though she refused to terminate the program entirely. The red pages remained active. The targets remained marked. But the killing would wait for better timing and more careful planning. The hiatus lasted years, not months. Israeli intelligence spent the mid-1970s rebuilding networks, improving tradecraft, and most importantly, locating Ali Salame, the prize that had eluded them at Lillehammer. Salame was not just the operational planner of Munich. He was the PLO's liaison with the CIA, a man who had negotiated protection for American diplomats in exchange for intelligence cooperation. A man who lived openly in Beirut, under what he believed was unbreakable security. Salame was also spectacularly visible. He drove a Land Rover with PLO plates through the streets of Beirut. He attended parties at foreign embassies. He had married a Lebanese beauty queen, Georgina Risk, Miss Universe 1971, and their wedding was covered by international media. For a man supposedly in hiding from Israeli assassins, he displayed remarkable confidence that his American connections and Lebanese bodyguards would keep him safe. They were wrong. Mossad spent over a year preparing the Salame operation. A female operative, known publicly only as Erica Chambers, rented an apartment overlooking the street where Salame's motorcade passed daily. She posed as an English artist, painted watercolors, socialized with neighbors, and every day recorded the exact timing of the Land Rover's passage. Other operatives photographed his security arrangements, mapped escape routes, and prepared a car bomb that would be parked along his daily route. On January 22, 1979, the operation executed. As Salame's Land Rover approached the intersection near his apartment, a Mossad operative detonated a Volkswagen packed with explosives. The blast killed Salame instantly, along with 4 bodyguards and several pedestrians. Erica Chambers walked calmly to a predetermined pickup point and was evacuated by sea. The CIA, which had been quietly warned that their assets' protection was no longer guaranteed, issued no public protest. The killing of Salame was Wrath of God's greatest success, but it did not end the operation. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, the program continued in various forms, targeting new generations of militants who had risen to replace those eliminated in the 1970s. Some killings were explosive, like the 1988 commando raid that killed Khalil al-Wazir, Abu Jihad, in his Tunis bedroom. Others were quiet, poison or gunshots in European cities, deaths that generated headlines for a day before vanishing into the ambiguity of unsolved cases. The operational ledger was extensive. By most estimates, Wrath of God and its successor programs eliminated between 20 and 35 individuals over 2 decades. Most were genuinely connected to terrorism. Some, like Bauchiki, were tragic errors. Others remained in disputed territory, men whose guilt was asserted by Israel but never proven to international satisfaction. The program's final target, Atef Bzeso, the PLO's director of intelligence, was shot in a Paris hotel in 1992, 2 decades after Munich, proving that Israeli memory was very long indeed. But here's the question that haunted those who designed and executed Wrath of God. Did it work? Did systematically assassinating Palestinian militants make Israel safer, or did it simply ensure that new militants would rise to replace those killed, motivated by vengeance rather than deterred by fear? The evidence is ambiguous. In the short term, the program disrupted Black September's European networks and forced PLO leadership to adopt more restrictive security measures that complicated their operations. The organization that executed Munich was effectively destroyed, its members killed, imprisoned, or driven so deep underground that they could no longer function. Yet Palestinian militancy itself continued, evolved, and eventually manifested in new organizations, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, that proved even more resistant to assassination than their predecessors. Former Mossad officers offered varied assessments in declassified interviews. Some argued that Wrath of God established essential deterrence, proving that attacking Israelis carried personal consequences for planners and financiers who might otherwise believe themselves safely distant from violence. Others acknowledged that the program created a cycle of retaliation that fed recruitment for terrorist organizations, that each killing generated new enemies even as it eliminated old ones. General Aharon Yariv, who had coordinated the operation's early phases, offered perhaps the most honest assessment decades later. I am not sure that we achieved anything lasting. We killed many men who deserved to die, but their sons remembered, their nephews remembered, and they are still fighting us today. What Operation Wrath of God revealed about the modern state was uncomfortable for those who prefer to believe that governments operate by law rather than force. It showed that beneath the veneer of international norms and diplomatic protocols, there exists a shadow system where certain nations grant themselves the authority to execute enemies through violence wrapped in bureaucratic language and approved by cabinet signatures rather than courts. The program established precedents that other nations would eventually follow. American drone strikes against terrorist leaders, Russian poisonings of dissidents abroad, Saudi execution of a journalist in a consulate, all these operations drew from a playbook that Mossad had written in the blood of the 1970s. Wrath of God proved that targeted assassination could be normalized, that it could become a standard tool of statecraft rather than an exceptional measure, and that the international community would ultimately acquiesce to its use by nations powerful enough to ignore criticism. Golda Meir never expressed public regret about the program she authorized. In private conversations, she acknowledged the weight of decisions that sent men to kill and accepted responsibility for the innocent blood spilled at Lillehammer. She understood that history would judge her actions differently depending on who was writing. To Israelis, she was the Iron Lady who refused to let the murder of her citizens go unanswered. To Palestinians, she was a war criminal who authorized extrajudicial executions across sovereign borders. Both descriptions contained truth. Neither captured the full complexity of choices made in the shadow of grief. The 11 athletes who died at Munich are memorialized at various sites in Israel and around the world. Their names are recited at Olympic ceremonies. Their stories are taught in schools. They became symbols of both vulnerability and resolve. Innocent men whose deaths changed how nations think about terrorism and response. The men who killed them are mostly dead themselves now, eliminated by Mossad bullets and bombs, killed in other conflicts, or simply aged into obscurity. The last confirmed survivor of the 8 who crossed that fence died in 2012, having spent decades in hiding before dying of natural causes. Whether he ever felt safe during those years, whether he slept easily knowing that somewhere a file with his name remained open, is something only he could answer. The operatives who hunted them are aging too. Some wrote memoirs, carefully vetted by Israeli censors, that reveal fragments of operations while protecting methods and sources. Others maintained silence, taking secrets to graves that bear no mention of their service. The keyed-on teams that executed Wrath of God have been replaced by new generations using new technologies, drones, and cyber weapons that their predecessors could not have imagined. But the fundamental calculus remains the same. When enemies strike, how far should a nation go to ensure they cannot strike again? Operation Wrath of God provides no comfortable answers. It demonstrates that vengeance can be systematized, that grief can be channeled into bureaucratic efficiency, and that the line between justice and murder dissolves when examined closely. It shows that targeted assassination can eliminate specific threats while generating new ones, that tactical success can coexist with strategic ambiguity. And it reveals that the shadow war never truly ends, that each operation creates ripples extending decades into a future that the original planners could not foresee. The Olympic Village in Munich still stands, though the building where the hostages died has been repurposed. Tourists walk past without knowing the history beneath their feet. The world has moved on to new atrocities, new memorials, new cycles of violence and response. But somewhere in archives classified for another 50 years, files remain that document every decision, every target, every bullet fired in the name of a nation's grief. Operation Wrath of God lasted 20 years. Its consequences last still. The methods pioneered in those operations, the safe houses and surveillance networks, the forged documents and escape routes, the psychological preparation for killing and the bureaucratic processes that authorized it, all of these became institutional knowledge passed down through generations of operatives. Young Mossad officers studied the Munich response as case history, learning both from successes like Salame and failures like Lillehammer. They absorbed the lesson that tradecraft matters, that errors cost lives on both sides of the equation. The philosophical questions remained unresolved. Could targeted killing ever be truly surgical, eliminating threats without creating new ones? Could a democracy authorize assassination and remain democratic? Could vengeance serve justice, Or did it merely perpetuate cycles that reason alone might break? These questions have no answers that satisfy everyone. They exist in the space where law dissolves into necessity, where ethics collide with survival, where grief demands action even when wisdom counsels restraint. Golda Meir died in 1978, 1 year before Salame. She did not live to see the final chapters of the operation she authorized. But the signature she placed on those red pages echoed through decades, authorizing deaths she would never witness, in cities she would never visit, against men whose faces she would never see. That is the nature of state power. Decisions made in secure rooms radiate outward into consequences their makers cannot fully control or comprehend. For the families of the 11, closure remained elusive. Some found purpose in advocacy, working to ensure that Olympic security would never again fail so catastrophically. Others retreated into private grief that public memorials could not ease. The widow of Moshe Weinberg, the wrestling coach who fought to the last, spent decades seeking recognition and compensation from Germany. Justice, if it came at all, came slowly and incompletely. And in the shadows, the files remain. Names crossed off, names still active. The architecture of vengeance, built in grief, maintained in secrecy, waiting for the next chapter that history has not yet written. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this investigation into the machinery of state vengeance made you see international relations differently, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe because we're exposing the operations that governments deny and the architecture of power that operates in perpetual shadow. Hit the notification bell. The next buried file is already waiting to be revealed.